All right, Nando. Can't wait to hear your commentary.
Alrighty. Well, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about something that's been on a lot of people's minds lately: right-wing populism. It's the topic du jour as hosts like Fox News' Tucker Carlson and The Hill's Saagar Enjeti have had tremendous success by challenging certain Republican Party orthodoxies and adopting a sort of pro-working man rhetoric. Here's Saagar explaining what he means by the new right.
What is the new right? It's a departure from the free market consensus that has broadly been established in the party since Barry Goldwater in the 1960s, and it's a return to the idea that we put our population at the center of our policy.
Yeah, the emergence of these new right-wing populists who talk a lot about caring about the welfare of the American worker while maintaining a sort of social conservatism on things like reproductive rights and a strong sense of nationalism has led to furious debates on the left about whether they should be engaged with as potential allies in a united populist front against the neoliberal ideologues that control both parties. And what the right-wing populists realize is that the center cannot hold, that the neoliberal era is exhausted and discredited, that citizens across the Western world are disgusted with it, and that they need to change their tune if they're going to remain relevant. And they've actually been quite successful. As Thomas Piketty points out, the traditional left-wing parties across the Western democracies have abandoned their former base, which was rooted in the working class, for what he calls the Brahmin left, meaning the intellectual elite. The right-wing parties, meanwhile, are dominated by what he calls the merchant right, meaning business elites. As Piketty writes, quote, "I argue that this structural evolution can contribute to explain rising inequality and the lack of democratic response to it, as well as the rise of populism, as low education, low-income voters might feel abandoned." And left-wing populists have propped up, such as Jeremy Corbyn in the UK and Bernie Sanders in the US, but they have not been as successful at gaining power than right-wing populists like Boris Johnson and Donald Trump have. And if you look at the class breakdown of voters, it is true that the Labour Party and the Democratic Party are both increasingly losing working class voters to their right-wing enemies. This was true in the UK as the Labour Party lost support in its former strongholds in the north. And as Matt Karp pointed out in our interview last week, the hottest new demographic in the Democratic primaries were those that he calls Halliburton Democrats. So the working class is up for grabs, and right-wing populism has certainly proven to be a seductive proposition for a decent chunk of it. There's only one problem, and that's that right-wing populism has existed in many ways throughout history, but it has always failed to meaningfully engage with the one thing that really matters when it comes to helping workers: labor unions. This is a point that Dustin Guastella makes.
That even though they're supposedly populist impulses, like these people on the new right and Trump himself, the thing that is consistent across all of them is anti-union, right? They are wall-to-wall anti-union. And even the ones who claim to want some realignment in the American system still can't bring themselves to terms with workers' own organizations. They really don't like the union movement.
And without strong support for labor unions, any meaningful wealth redistribution is essentially impossible. And without wealth redistribution, there is no real populism. What we have instead, as shown by the supposedly right-wing populist Trump, is historic legislation to redistribute wealth upward to the already super rich, the elites that he constantly rails against. In 2017, he passed the Trump tax cut, which represented a $2 trillion windfall to the rich, and in 2020, he signed the CARES Act, which provided the rich with a further $6 trillion. But now, a new proposal from one of the intellectual architects of the new right, a guy named Orrin Cass, makes the conservative case for unions. On Labor Day, his organization, the American Compass, released its proposal saying, quote, "Institutions of organized labor have traditionally been the mechanism by which workers take collective action and gain representation and bargaining power in the private sector. Strong worker representation can make America stronger. Unfortunately, our nation's Great Depression-era labor laws no longer provide an effective framework. Many unions have become unresponsive to workers' needs, and some outright corrupt, and membership has fallen to just 6% of the private sector workforce. Rather than cheer the demise of a once valuable institution, conservatives should seek reform and reinvigoration of the laws that govern organizing and collective bargaining." He explains further on Saagar Enjeti's podcast, The Realignment.
Why should conservatives care about organized labor? As you said, and I think, look, this is one of the most common and I think fair critiques that we get from left populists is if you people are serious, then you should care about unions. And Michael Lind, who has been on this podcast and I think has always made it such a profound point, is that in a way, a union is a very conservative institution. It's a non-governmental way for workers to organize and barter for wages and better conditions of life that don't require an outright federal intervention in order to achieve a optimal societal goal. So just talk a little bit about maybe why conservatives seem to hate unions so much in the first place. Are you outright now pro-union? What does that mean? What does a conservative pro-labor posture look like? Just go into all of that.
Yeah, I think the starting point, exactly as you just alluded to, is we have to clarify what we mean by union or organized labor. That the way that unions work in America today is obviously very dysfunctional. And I think a lot of the criticism that the traditional right of center has is exactly right. And increasingly you hear it from the left of center too. A lot of the smartest and most thoughtful left of center labor leaders, labor scholars will say that just this system does not make sense, is not working. And the answer isn't what the Democratic Party wants, which is just how do we force more people into these unions so they'll pay dues and support Democratic politicians. But that the system that we have is a very different question from the concept of labor, the concept that workers should be able to come together and organize and then exert power in the marketplace, have representation in the workplace, be able to work collectively for their own interests and to come to each other's aid and support.
Yeah. Now, if it were true in some theoretical sense that the Republican Party all of a sudden outflanked the Democratic Party on the issue of collective bargaining on the left, that could potentially be a very big problem. This is how our late friend Michael Brooks reacted to that Dustin Guastella remark from a little earlier.
If there was a right-wing populism that was reformulating key economic issues, that would both be, we would be in an even more serious and dangerous crisis, and conversely, the dialectic, we would be in much more interesting and dynamic times.
And Dustin, for his part, agrees that that would be a very serious threat.
If the populist right had an economic program, it would mean that they could actually redistribute wealth. And that would be a scary thing for the left, because they wouldn't change their convictions around xenophobia, and they wouldn't change their convictions around bigotry, and they wouldn't change their convictions around unions. But if they actually wanted to redistribute wealth, they could win a lot more votes.
100%.
That's I think, the thing that we have to, that's the balance we have to keep aware of.
And the question is, can the Republican Party transform itself into the party that advocates for the working class against their corporate overlords? I don't think so. We love to shit on Democrats because of their fecklessness and corruption, but that party, as decrepit as it is not as captured by the merchant right or business elites as the Republican Party. As Jacobin founder Bhaskar Sunkara wrote in response to the Orencast proposal, you can't endorse the interests of organized labor when the most important bloc in your party are big capitalists who don't want to compromise profits and control. They're too powerful to be cajoled into some sort of corporatist arrangement either. But that does not mean that we should not take the populist right seriously as a threat. As the Democrats drift more and more towards the party of the cultural elite, there will be significant portions of the working class that are susceptible to the rhetoric coming from the right. And I don't want to make the hysterical point that the guys like Tucker Carlson or Josh Hawley are the same as Nazis, but it is true that the fascists across Europe in the 1930s adopted a lot of the rhetoric of the left in order to peel off some working class voters away from the mass socialist parties. Right-wing populism emerges as a sort of response to a rising and powerful left. Classical fascism was, in part, effectively a massive employment program. Get the economy working by taking over industry and employing millions to build a war machine. And Mussolini actually passed several social insurance measures in the 1920s and strengthened what we would call the welfare state. In fact, when New York City politician Grover Aloysius Whalen asked Mussolini about the meaning behind Italian fascism in 1939, the reply was, "It's like your New Deal." They had to do this in part because Italy's northern manufacturing base was highly unionized and militant. Modern right-wing populism is just too wed to neoliberal economics, and the capitalist class is not willing to give up ownership to stop a militant trade union movement, because there isn't a militant trade union movement right now. And a perfect example of this is Trump refusing to use the Defense Production Act to essentially force industrialists to make PPE in response to the coronavirus. So while I don't think that Orrin Cass's proposals will be seriously adopted by any Republican lawmakers in the near future, as neoliberalism is in its final death throes, something is going to take its place. We on the left need to build a true class politics that goes beyond the culture war bullshit that divides the Brahmins from the working class. If we don't do that, blood and soil nationalism will rise from the ashes of neoliberalism.
That was one of the more comprehensive and well thought out arguments I heard in regard to the populist right. And I know that it's like this controversial debate. I don't really think it needs to be. I think that, pulling from history to make your point is so important because we have history to learn from. And, when you think about the kind of rhetoric that was utilized by the Trump administration and the GOP to get Americans on board for the 2017 Trump-era tax cuts, what did they focus on? What did they continuously talk about? How it's a middle-class tax cut. And even using that rhetoric, people didn't buy it. If you look at polling, the majority of Americans, including the majority of Republicans, voters, were not in favor of the tax cuts because they knew that it was really just going to be tax cuts for the wealthy. And funny story, there's this thing called the Web Summit that takes place every year. And I remember being at the Web Summit, listening to a panel where there were a few conservatives who were pushing for the Trump tax cuts. And one of the panelists said, middle class tax cut. I had just lost my voice from laryngitis, and I was like, it's for the wealthy. It's for the... and my husband's like, relax, calm down. But anyway, I just see it as a Trojan horse. Yeah. It's a Trojan horse. Like, we all know it. We see the utter disdain the Republican Party and conservatives have for working people. We also see how Tucker Carlson uses populist language to reel people in, and then he immediately pivots to the xenophobia, the homophobia, the bigotry, all of that, the anti-immigration rhetoric. So I just see it as an avenue in which, they exploit the vulnerabilities of working people in order to inject their poison and their venom. Yeah. And we just don't need it, and we shouldn't fall for it.
I mean, the Tucker Carlson thing in general just annoys me because I'm old enough to remember young Tucker Carlson, who was like a cartoon elitist. I mean, like he wore a bow tie. I mean, this is not like controversial a take or anything like that. I mean, just his rebrand as this sort of working man's hero is just so remarkable. But like what I think is important to understand is that there's certain people who you could call quote unquote on the left who are adopting this pose of treating these right-wing populists kind of at face value without an understanding of the historical context, but also rejecting sort of the traditional left arguments, mostly out of a sort of what I would call a cultural war grievance about some of the more annoying aspects of the culture on the left in this country. And so they're calling themselves like post-left or whatever. And like what that is to me is just a sort of an arrogant rejection of all these debates. All the debates we're having today have already been had a million times. I mean, this is a point I always make. There is no such thing as a new politics. Like you can tweak certain things, like yes, the gig economy does feel like a kind of a new thing, a new challenge, and things like that. But for the most part, these debates that we are raging today have already been had 100 years ago by people way smarter than us. And all you need to do is look back and understand, and like that. So to sort of believe that you can come up with some sort of new synthesis is just like to me incredibly arrogant and just foolhardy. And what you're doing is just walking into the lion's den. Like the right-wing populists are not going to be your friends. I'm not saying you should like cancel them or like, you know, anyone who appears on Rising is like platforming fascism or whatever. Like that's not what I'm saying at all. You know, and I'm not criticizing like someone like Bernie Sanders kind of strategically working with, you know, a right-winger on certain bills that, you know, there might be some overlap on. That's not the point. The point is that we need to take them seriously and provide a real alternative, because if we don't, like, they're going to win and they're going to beat us. I don't know how to explain it.
No, you're okay. So I want to differentiate because I think that there's a mistake in confusing these people in positions of power, people like Tucker Carlson or members of the GOP who use populist rhetoric, right, in order to basically appeal to people when in reality, like their underlying objectives are actually against labor. They're different from, let's say there are conservative members of the electorate, right? They're maybe socially conservative, but they're workers.
Yeah.
And so I think that the Democratic Party, or unfortunately, we still have to function under the Democratic Party, right? Like, yeah. I think movements need to have broad coalitions. And I think one of the things that works against us is this holier than thou, self-righteous, like purity nonsense, where we don't want to work with people. And when I say we, I don't literally mean the two of us, but I mean the left doesn't want to necessarily work with people if they don't 100% agree with them on every social issue. And I think that that's wrong. I think you can bring people in and you can persuade them to maybe change their minds on certain social issues. But we have to focus on what unites us as workers. Yeah. And it's really the material conditions that we're dealing with in this country, where inequality continues to be a bigger issue every year, a bigger problem every year. So, I think that there's that differentiating doesn't really happen much in these conversations. And I think that we need to pivot to that.
Yeah. No, this is a point that Dustin made in that Michael clip. If you watch the whole thing, it's like this is something that Republicans understand very well. Republicans don't run on their most unpopular policies. They pass them once they're in power. I mean, like eviscerating worker protections is unpopular. They never talk about it on the campaign trail, but they do it once they're in power because it's something they believe in. Right? You know, the left can do the same thing. This is something that Bernie in general was very good at, is focusing on the stuff that was popular about his agenda and trying to avoid the stuff that was as unpopular, which doesn't mean that he's changing his convictions or throwing anyone under the bus. It's just, you know, the rhetorical style you adopt and all that stuff is important in trying to win over and have certain crossover appeal with regular voters and especially with workers. You know, that doesn't mean that that Tucker Carlson is the same as, you know, some worker in wherever in the middle of the country. It's a different thing.
Right. You
know, you're competing with Tucker Carlson for that person's attention and support. And it's just, we have to like see that in a fundamentally different way. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right.